Okay, so we've talked about the Hebrews and Judaism, and we've talked about Christianity. So the last of the three foundational monotheistic faiths we're going to talk about is Islam. We won't stop talking about these because they are currents that run through Western Civ 1, but just to sort of give us a good background on all of this, I'll cover the Quran next. So one thing to understand that I think a lot of people don't understand about the Quran is how connected it is to Christianity and Judaism. It's not just that they're three monotheistic faiths that have nothing to do with each other. They're actually they actually use the same foundational text, which we refer to as the Old Testament, but it's really the Hebrew Scriptures. And they share the prophet Abraham. That's a common thread from one text to the other, so that's important. If you remember from reading the book of Genesis, you remember that Abraham has a child with his wife's handmaid, right? Her name is Hagar, and he has a child with her, and he sends the child off. He sends Hagar and the child off eventually because his wife Sarah rejects the child. This child is named Ishmael, and actually, so Abraham is the father of Ishmael, and Ishmael is said to be the ancestor of the Arab people. So, again, it's not something we can verify, but legend says that, Abraham is the father of the Islamic faith. In Islam, they believe that Abraham is the first believer in one true God, so that's a commonality that all three of those faiths share. Abraham is, he's, according to the Islamic faith, he's the person who built the Kaaba at Mecca, and that's a really important structure. You'll learn about that in the video that you're gonna watch, so I won't detail it too much here, but that's a thing to remember. When you read the Quran, you'll see that they refer to the people of the book, and they're talking about Jews and Christians here. So the same prophets that we're dealing with from the book of Genesis, right? People like Noah and Abraham and Adam. These are prophets for Islam too. The only difference is, well, between Islam and Christianity, remember that Jesus is supposed to be the Messiah. For Islam, Jesus is just another prophet. So he's basically has the same status as Abraham and Noah. Muhammad is the last in the long line of prophets according to Islam. So even though there are a lot of commonalities between the three big monotheistic faiths, there are a lot of differences too. One thing to remember is that we're talking about the same God. Although in Islam we refer to him as Allah, it's the same God. It's Yahweh in the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Lord. It's God in the New Testament. It's the same God. We're not talking about a different God here. However, in Islam, we view God in kind of a different way. So, in the Quran, the view that you get of God it's very abstract, especially compared to the Hebrew Scriptures, and to an extent the New Testament, where, for example, you have God talking to people, right? Talking to prophets, or appearing to Moses in a burning bush in the Hebrew Scriptures. God is very impersonal in the Quran. He doesn't communicate directly with people. So this impersonality of Allah is something that really distinguishes Islam from Christianity. However, I mean, remember we looked at the different writers, or the different sources that make up the Hebrew Scriptures, and some of those sources treat God differently also. So I guess you could say that to some extent, you do get some of that impersonality in the Hebrew Scriptures as well. Another big difference is the sort of emphasis, especially, and this is especially holds for Christianity and Islam. So in Christianity, you would say that the emphasis is on both the message and the prophet. So it's the message of God's love and, saving mankind, and it's a message about Jesus, right? But in the Quran, the message is the only important part. Muhammad, as a prophet, he's just a messenger. He's a significant messenger because he's the final prophet, but they rarely discuss Muhammad himself, right? Whereas, remember from looking at the Gospel of Luke, and if you've ever read any of the other Gospels, they're all about Jesus, right? They're all about this prophet. So, in the Quran, the biggest aspect is the greater message of the book. One thing that I think that is really interesting and neat about Islam is the way that the faith is structured. It's based on simplicity and accessibility. So in Islam, there's no clergy, there aren't priests, there aren't saints that you have to deal with, and we'll kind of get to talk about this later on in the semester when we get to reading Martin Luther, but in Islam, you worship God directly. There's no kind of middleman. And then, so we'll talk about the 5 pillars of the Islamic faith, and they are geared toward the same sense of accessibility. So the Christian tradition is very concerned with doctrine, right? It's what does the text say? Interpreting that, what does it mean? You would say that in Islam, the emphasis is not on a doctrine, but rather it's on behavior, right? It's on what you do, not what you believe. So in that way, we call Islam a religion of praxis. It's not what you believe that's important, it's what you do and how your actions manifest themselves in everyday life. And that's what actually matters more than memorizing the Nicene Creed, for example. You'll learn a lot more about Muhammad in the video that you watch, but I'll just give you like a short primer on a little bit about him. He is he's a member of a Bedouin tribe who is orphaned when he's young, and he's sent to live in Mecca, and he's kind of raised among a community, and because he's kind of cast out when he's young, he really is able to cultivate this sense of empathy and concern for the people who are like him, the people who are left out of society, especially in a society like the Bedouin Arab culture, where your success is really based on the clan or the family that you belong to, and that's why we say that Islam has a really strong message of social justice, because Muhammad himself is really concerned with making sure that the people who are on the fringes of society can be included somehow. That's really similar to the way that we see Jesus portrayed in the Gospel of Luke, right? Remember I said that one of the key things about Luke is how Jesus interacts with these people who have been shoved out of society. So I think that's a really cool similarity between the two. It's a mistake to think that Muhammad is just a religious figure for Islam, though. He is a prophet and he's a warrior. He is a judge. He's a lawyer. He is the mayor of a city, in addition to being a day-to-day religious teacher. So I would say that his role is a lot more expanded than the role of Jesus, especially as a prophet. So I'm going to stop that one here, and then I'll do a really short lecture on the 5 pillars of Islam, and then we will watch a video for the rest. So.